Hi, everyone. Drug addiction is a pervasive problem in America, and one that probably affects us relatively personally. Unfortunately, it often doesn't occur by itself. How do we, as clinicians, approach treating such pervasive disorder when it could be complicated by symptoms of another one? Today, I'll be talking about specifically the interaction between substance use and obsessive compulsive disorder, and what implications this has for how we see and treat possible addiction. So first, obsessive compulsive disorder, as defined by the DSM-5, is the presence of a collection of unwanted thoughts, images, or urges, which we deem obsessions, and intentional rituals, which we deem compulsions. Compulsivity is the act of engaging in these thoughts or actions repetitively and deliberately, despite possible negative consequences. So compulsivity is pervasive among obsessive compulsive disorder and substance use, and is a key factor of both of these disorders. OCD is a fairly low prevalence disorder, appearing in about 1% to 2% of the population, varied based on some different demographic factors. Despite its rarity, however, it is fairly comorbid or co-occurring with other psychiatric disorders, namely depression, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social phobias, along with alcohol and drug use disorders. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing on these last two disorders. So the first thing you need to know is that OCD is a heterogeneous disorder, meaning that it has a variety of symptoms that could be grouped into their own specific subcategories. Some of these categories you may have heard about before, such as contamination and cleaning obsessions, hoarding, symmetry and ordering, intrusive thoughts, and harm obsessions and checking behaviors. So we've heard about these all colloquially, and obsessive and compulsive symptoms are prevalent within all of these subgroups, and those symptoms tend to drive each other. And in the kind of basic hypothesis of OCD, we see that individuals try to battle these obsessive or intrusive thoughts by engaging in these compulsive behaviors as kind of an outlet or stabilizer. And these actions can be originated in one area of the brain, here in red, what we call kind of the striatal areas, based on some cue from the environment, such as, for example, dirty desk or dirty dishes or disorder. And then could be regulated somehow by your decision-making brain, the frontal cortex, here in blue, by either inhibiting those behaviors if they're harmful or propagating them if we think they're helpful. So this inhibitory control circuit is dysregulated in OCD and substance use as well. So because of this overlap and compulsivity between the two disorders, a theory has been suggested that these two disorders may overlap at a moderate severity of both of them, at a point on which OCD is at not an interfering level that people can't actually engage in any outside activities such as substance use, and substance use is at a point at which it's severe enough that it's not just impulsive drug taking, but actually compulsive disorder. So based on all of this information, I thought, what subgroups of OCD do actually occur within a non-clinical sample, and what associations with substance use do these specific subgroups have? So in order to answer this question, I analyzed data from two phases. First one was from the National Comorbidity Survey replication, which is an enormous data set that was collected in 2001 through 2003, asking questions about various psychiatric disorders, including OCD and substance use disorders. And this is just an example of the possible questions the participants were asked. And I used an analysis that basically told me what kind of possible underlying subgroups existed within a range of OCD symptoms. In this case, it was 8 different OCD subgroups or symptoms. And I came up with a prevalent majority of the individuals that answered questions in the survey had no symptoms at all, which is not surprising. It's consistent with the idea that OCD is fairly lowly prevalent within the population. However, I did come up with two subgroups, one with just compulsive symptoms and one with both obsessive and compulsive symptoms. And after I got this kind of model, I associated these possible subgroups with different substance use features assessed for in the NCSR. And I found that individuals with both obsessive and compulsive symptoms are more likely to be diagnosed with alcohol abuse, alcohol dependence, and drug abuse disorders. This is also unsurprising, since an individual portraying both obsessive and compulsive symptoms is more likely to be kind of on the clinical spectrum of OCD rather than a person with just compulsive symptoms. So it would make sense that they're more likely to be diagnosed with another clinical disorder. The compulsive symptoms only subgroup was associated with kind of an increased urge to smoke tobacco, but that's pretty much it, and they weren't necessarily associated with as much clinically significant substance use symptoms. So The problem with the NCSR is that it was collected in 2001 through 2003, which is kind of dated, and it also didn't necessarily answer the questions that I wanted to answer, along the lines of, the frequency of substance use disorders and the frequency of obsessive and compulsive symptoms, et cetera. So I took it upon myself to compile my own survey and put it online, from which I put together 4 different questionnaires getting at 17 different OCD symptoms instead of 8, along with a bunch of substance use features, including frequency, thoughts related to use, expectance of use, et cetera. And this is also an example of questions that people had to answer. And I put it on a platform called Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is basically a crowdsourcing website on which you can put any job you want, including a survey, and people can complete it with some amount of money. So thanks, Gilachan, for funding me. So again, I ran the same analysis and came up with a slightly more interesting differentiation of subgroups. Again, most people have no symptoms at all, not surprising. However, the OCD symptoms, or the OCD subgroups that I did find were more differentiated on severity rather than kind of types of symptoms. And when looking at the mild OCD subgroup, I found that they were related with more alcohol, cannabis, and other substance use, as well as a higher interference related to this substance use. When looking at the moderate and the moderate severe OCD subgroups, I found that not only was there an increase in alcohol use, there was also more negative expectations associated with drinking, and decreased desire for drug use at all, and along with that, interference related to use. And this kind of told me that some subgroups tend to be at a higher risk of developing a more clinical and a more severe and inhibiting substance use disorder, or at least possible substance use features that may exacerbate their OCD symptoms. I also came up with kind of more normative subgroups, which were associated with an increase in nicotine use. And you could equate this to the compulsives only subgroup that I found in the other analysis. And these are people that might have OCD-like personality features, but not necessarily kind of a clinical disorder. And so I kind of explained these results by, people that might have more mild OCD features would self-medicate more often and might use some kind of mild substance in their everyday life. Also, finally, the no symptoms class was associated with alcohol use as a tension reducer, which is not surprising because I'm sure that all of you do that often as well, possibly also tonight. So, in conclusion, I found distinct subgroups of OCD that appear in different samples representative of the general population across time from kind of the early 2000s and today. Along with that, I found that substance use is indeed more likely to appear in individuals with OCD than those without, which is promising, and that's what we've seen in prior literature. And specifically, the presentation of substance use, so the kind of inhibition that is associated with it, thoughts that are associated with it, differs based on severity in individuals with OCD. And this is crucial information that we need to keep in mind when we're formulating treatment protocols for individuals with comorbid disorders. Thank you. Yes, Jess?
I have a question about, so going back to, your previous slide, the superstitious pie chart size,
Yeah.
What is that?
Good question. So this analysis is made for exploratory data analysis, and essentially I have little control of kind of what comes out of it. So I have a group of symptoms, so in this case 17 OCD symptoms, and then I just pull it into the analysis, and it tells me that these 6 subgroups are likely to occur. So one of them was this superstitious class. They were kind of elevated on need for confession, sexual and religious intrusive thoughts. There's one other one, fear of terrible things happening, stuff like that. So I had a hard time categorizing that and naming it something that made sense. So I kind of went with that. But both the anxious somatic and the superstitious subgroups were kind of on the lower severity of OCD symptoms in general. So that's why I associated with them with kind of a more normative subgroup of people that may just be more superstitious or may just be kind of more anxious broadly, but not necessarily have OCD. Yeah.
So in your survey, there's a bigger slice of the pie of people who have some kind of symptoms. Mm-hmm. Did you collect any other kind of demographic data or anything to indicate why in your survey there was a higher percentage?
Yeah. Demographics didn't change that much. So Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't put as much validity on my survey as I would on the other one. The other one was conducted by like people at Harvard that know how to do this. It's like a 10-year-long thing. So their measures are very valid, and they ask very specific questions that kind of get at more almost clinical possibilities. Mine was definitely more subclinical and catered to audiences that may not necessarily be diagnosed with any disorders at all. So I can't speak to the validity of the responses on my survey. But I also think that the increase in the amount of symptoms that I tested for, so the other survey tested for 8, I tested for 17, might have kind of contributed to this variety. Yeah.
So you had a very interesting graph at the beginning that suggested that the OCD percentage of the population decreases with age. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what's behind that, if it's known?
Absolutely. So OCD is known to be an early onset disorder, meaning that it occurs more often in individuals like of adolescence or so. So I think age of 12 to 15 is about the normal age of onset. So as with actually most anxiety disorders, they decrease with age. So adolescents and young adults are more likely to experience these disorders in general, including OCD. OCD actually, since 2013 is no longer, but used to be termed an anxiety disorder as well. So that's unsurprising. But yeah, I think that these anxiety features, and including the OCD features, kind of decrease with age for sure. And OCD, we definitely see it a lot more in young adults and adolescents. So, okay, thank you.